Noth Clipper, hi friends, Darth Momo here. So the YouTube channel Plagiarisms has made a response video, or a debunking of my little clip from my 6-hour George Lucas video about the Clone Wars and the alleged retcons that it has with the films. We're here to respond because I watched his video and that was not really much of a debunking. A lot of it was just him giving out his own personal opinions about how he felt about creative choices in the Clone Wars, or how he liked things in the Clone Wars multimedia project more than TCW, which, that's fine. I'm not saying you have to like TCW more than the EU or anything. You know, you don't have to like TCW. But, you know, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not Lucas's vision, or that it's, you know, irreconcilable with the films or something like that. So, real quick before we get into it, though, I gotta ask the question: why? Why bother? You know, look at his stats on here. You know, he's got 12.7k subscribers. I'm at 1.5, not even. You know, look at the views that this video is made in 8 hours, as opposed to mine's got maybe 700 as opposed for the 4 days it was out. Like, and that's one of my better performing videos. So, like, why is he coming after me? You know, I mean, I'm not saying I'm, you know, but I'm above criticism. I mean, I've gone at it with some of the other EU guys out there, but we're all on similar levels. Like, why is he beaten down? You know, I don't know too much about Plagiarisms, but I know he recently kind of got called out by Darth Melvin. There was a whole kind of expose video of Plagiarisms or whatever, like an attack. And, you know, his kind of response after that, within the next couple of days, he's like, well, I'm retiring from YouTube. And then he kind of walked it back a little. He's like, actually, I'm going to keep doing YouTube, but we're going to retire from Star Wars videos. And then he kind of walked it back completely. And he's like, actually, we're going back to how things were before. So it's like, I don't know. I'm sitting here wondering, and I'm not trying to create beef with this guy, right? You know, but like, was his pride hurt? And he decided, you know what? Here's a small guy. I'm going to try to take what might be an easy victory lap against him. Like, was that his goal? I mean, I've only watched a couple of his videos before. I've left a couple comments. Like, I've never directly interacted with this guy. I didn't tag him in any of the EU videos I made. So, like, you know, I wonder. I'm just genuinely curious. But you know what? Like, I've done reaction wars like this before already. It's a waste of time. It's drags on. So, like, you know, Plagiarisms, if you watch this and you want to have some sort of, like, further interaction or dialogue, you know, let's not do this back and forth video. Let's have a conversation. You know, that's I extend my invitation to you. If you want to let it end here, I'm fine with that. Let's let it end here. But if you want to keep going, let's have a conversation. Let's not just keep going at it like little kids, you know, with this crap. But without further ado, let's dig into this.
Hello there. I'm the serial plagiarist, and today I wanted to respond to a small channel called Darth Momo that tries to make the case for why TCW doesn't retcon the movies. They do, but there's something that's far more important that they do. Change the meaning of the story. There's a lot of retcons in fiction, after all, that ultimately don't matter. Rearranging dates in a story's timeline, for example, is mostly harmless. Who cares? But if your retcon affects the
well, a lot of the EU purists seem to care about that.
story in a way where it makes it weaker, then obviously we're gonna have a problem. Also, retcons can be a sign of laziness or trying to have a get-out-of-jail-free card. I'll explain this more in detail as we go on, but for now, let's play this shit.
So, he talks about right off the bat, he says it's not necessarily, it doesn't seem like his beef is completely, you know, factual retcons, but a lot of it he seems to not like the reinterpretations of the story. So, I mean, to that I would say, like, you know, and we'll see what his reasonings are, if I actually even agree with that. But let's say he's right. Let's say TCW reinterprets the prequels or the movies. Well, the original trilogy was reinterpreted by the prequels. The original trilogy, as itself, as we were presented with the story, it was just a story about, you know, a Jedi, or a farm boy becoming a Jedi. That was the story of A New Hope, right? It was a story about a farm boy becoming a Jedi. And then Empire reinterpreted it to now it's like, it's a family soap opera, right? It's a drama. All that Darth Vader stuff, that was not in the original production of A New Hope. Darth Vader was not Luke's father. So Empire and Jedi reinterpreted A New Hope, and then the original trilogy as we had it, it was a story about a family, right? There was none of this, like, galactic, a prophecy and all that, like, myth to it. It was a story about a father or a child redeeming his father, right? And then the prequels kind of added this whole element of like, well, actually, we're reinterpreting that. It's about, it's about the chosen one prophecy. There's this whole like, mythic element to it now in universe, not just the mythic kind of concepts we see it as from an audience perspective, but like in universe. Anakin is not just a guy who was good and then became bad. He's now a tragic figure, because, the original trilogy doesn't really hint to him being a tragic figure. It's more so he was, seduced by power. Prequels reinterpret that to make him a tragic figure. They also interpret that to make him a figure of prophecy. And George Lucas's sequel trilogy treatments would have also reinterpreted that. They would have reinterpreted the prophecy to be Leia being the chosen one. Those are Lucas's own words. And, you could say treatments were never got made. Well, that was a starting point for Lucas. That was where he was starting with. So reinterpretation does not necessarily mean retcon. You don't have to like how it reinterpreted the story, that's fine, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's a straight up retcon. I'm more concerned about factual retcons, because that's what a retcon actually is.
Comment sections, I've still engaged with people who refuse to accept TCW because it retcons the films. They'll give out...
And keep in mind the context. He cut out the first part of this video, but this was a clip from my 6-hour video about George Lucas and the EU, and this was addressing various EU purist / elitist channels out there that I've been interacting with. So this was not just a standalone video, I point out. I put a clip from it, but at the very beginning I say, this is a clip from this video. So a lot of what I'm addressing is addressing specific EU purists and elitists that I've, addressed and dealt with over the last few months. This isn't necessarily just a wider... a lot of it still stands, but that's kind of the context behind the video.
Various retcons that can be reconciled, just like other EU or film retcons, but because they don't like TCW, they won't put in any effort into doing some critical thinking to resolve the matter. I don't agree with that whatsoever. Actually, I think I have thought about this extensively, considered nuances, and
So again, it wasn't a specific address to JJ Plagiarisms. This was an address I'd have to EU purists who would say, well, there's no retcons between the EU and the movies because of this, this, and this. Oh, but there is retcons because of TCW. And I'd be like, well, how about this? How about this? Well, no, that's not a valid explanation. It's a retcon. No. So, as for JJ Plagiarisms, he said he's thought about it. Okay, maybe we came to different conclusions then, I guess. I don't know. Like, you may have personal issues with it, but I put in some effort. And here are my explanations for why none of that's retcons is actually retcons. So don't just say, well, I thought about it and I disagree. Well, hear out what I have to say, and then...
I'm still at the conclusion that the Clone Wars is an
comment on that.
Backtracking mess.
This is the new
don't tell me we're gonna have to deal with this.
With Intel inside.
The video isn't really a TCW apologist video, but since it's relevant, I'll briefly address these supposed retcons. Anakin's character seems to be the biggest one. Well, no shit, he's the biggest character in all of Star Wars. The way anyone portrays him will be studied under a microscope. This is...
Okay. That's... Like, okay, I was saying I understand that people think it's the biggest one. I don't know why you gotta interject with your profanity and be like, ugh, like it kind of screams ego in a sense.
Something I've already addressed. Anakin is simply at the worst points in his life during episodes 2 and 3. I wouldn't know that from watching TCW. I would with Star Wars Republic, or what...
What do you mean you wouldn't know that from watching TCW? If you're watching TCW, the general assumption is you've seen the films. And if you haven't seen the films, then TCW is a self-contained thing. But if you're watching TCW, like, when Anakin's got something rough, like perhaps the Clovis arc, for example, he's kind of different compared to how he is just normal, average, everyday in the show. And when you look at in the movies, there's elements of both of these, kind of aspects of his personality that seep through. When he's dealing with, like, his mom or the Padme stuff in Revenge of the Sith, there's a different side of Anakin than we see when he's at the Battle of Geonosis, the Battle of Coruscant. So, no, I'm saying the films are his worst point in life. TCW is everyday Anakin. And there are glimpses of Anakin struggling the same way he is in the prequel trilogy in certain moments in TCW, but those are in moments like the Padme Rush Clovis stuff where it really hits close to home. It's not just his average General Anakin Skywalker persona.
Watching the micro series, I suppose it goes with the show treating Republic war crimes like a joke. Like seriously,
I saw someone say in a comment somewhere, I don't remember if this was on his video or somewhere else, but the war crimes thing, like, this isn't, 1940s or post-1940s Earth. Like, war crimes might be different, or might be different in the galaxy far, far away. In the canceled Clone Wars episodes, we know Obi-Wan mentioned something, it was the Crystal Crisis episodes, about a Yavin code, but that's all we know. So you're interpreting war crimes from a real-world perspective. This is, to quote Hayden Christensen, this is, a galaxy far, far away. Right off the bat, we're throwing all rules out the window. I mean, if we're really going at it from a real-world perspective, you're going to bring up things like war crimes. I could talk about how things in space don't work the way we see them in, Earth, but it's a different galaxy, it's a whole different universe, etc.
Except the good guys are good because they're good, and the bad guys are bad because they're bad. With next to no regard for scaling character morality properly. TCW.
And notice here too, he's talking about like how TCW approaches like the morality and war crimes and all that versus we'll just call it the multimedia project. That's all the EU, the micro series, etc., the comics. He's not talking about that as a retcon. If you listen to the way he's talking, it's just a matter of, well, this is better. I like this more. Okay, that doesn't mean it's a retcon.
TCW is everyday Anakin. TCW also explored his maturing by introducing Ahsoka, forcing him to grow up so he can be responsible. It's an artificial cop-out by pretending that's the reason. I can guarantee the more practical...
That's what Lucas said. That's what Lucas said he did it for, or like the reasoning behind it. And it's kind of in the show too. Like, they give him a Padawan right off the bat to try to help mature him. Wartime does mature people, and we see that in the show through the eyes of, like, Ahsoka, for example. So that's what the show says. You don't have to like it. You can say you wish something else was different, but that doesn't mean it's a retcon.
The reason wasn't to explain Anakin's maturity, but rather to present Anakin as mature right off the bat. It was very reactive to prequel hate in general, and it's actually why Anakin is so stale.
So this whole thing about prequel hate, I've already addressed this in my longer 6-hour George Lucas video in the Clone Wars section, but the prequel hate narrative does not, hold up. Like, just for starters, if we're going to say things like, oh, the Clone Wars was just basically a reaction to prequel hate, okay, what are some of the most loathed aspects about the prequels? Jar Jar Binks? The politics? We've got Jar Jar taking front center, spot in 4 episodes of Clone Wars Season 1. We've got so many politics episodes littered throughout the show. If this was a backlash, or, a response to the prequel backlash, those aspects and elements would have been gone out of there.
Why they gave him a deep voice right off the bat. They were too scared to have Anakin start off anything.
I mean, the deep voice is something I'm a little understanding of. There's some people who, I've seen, like, Anomaly Inc. I was just watching some of his videos the other day. He's a big George Lucas guy. The voice didn't bother him at all. In fact, actually, he hated Matt Lucas. I think Matt Lucas maybe sounds a bit closer to Hayden Christensen, but there's moments where, like, I'll see certain lines from them, like, Matt Lanner and Hayden played right or side by side. It's like, okay, there's a little bit of a difference, but then there's some lines where it's like, okay, they sound pretty similar. So, I mean, if you don't like that, that's fine, but, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a retcon.
The clones. I think how they present Anakin in the show is a dead giveaway. And when you learn that Matt Lucas, the original voice of Anakin, was super ready to reprise the role, he was even practicing, they rejected him. That says a lot. Some say
maybe they just didn't want Matt Lucas there. I don't know, maybe they weren't too happy with what he did on the micro series, or maybe they wanted someone who was able to bring, a different kind of background to Anakin, a different approach. Not necessarily in the sense of, like, we're changing Anakin, but, like, this show was obviously, it wasn't going to be, just little 2-minute episodes. It was going to be full on, 20-minute episodes of television. So maybe they wanted someone who could be a bit more dynamic with character and with scenes and with, I think you know what I'm trying to say. With just different, like, acting ranges, I guess. As for the bridge between Attack of the Clones and, like they said, they change Anakin right off the bat. Well, all we see of Anakin prior to Ahsoka coming on board is, General Skywalker type persona. And like I said, it's pretty in line with what we see General Skywalker as in Revenge of the Sith and I guess Commander Skywalker in Attack of the Clones at the Battle of Geonosis. And if you look at how he treats Ahsoka and how he acts about it in the Clone Wars movie as opposed to seasons 4, seasons 5, there is definitely a bit more of Attack of the Clones Anakin in there than Revenge of the Sith. I wouldn't say it's straight on, Attack of the Clones Anakin, but there's a bit more, we're leaning a bit more Attack of the Clones than we are Revenge of the Sith. But even then, it's still the Revenge of the Sith personality of Anakin. There's still elements of what we see in Attack of the Clones in there. The gap wasn't bridged as well as you like, but writing quality is not retcon. That's different. You could say it wasn't written as well, but that doesn't mean it retcons anything.
For the slow maturing in the Clone Wars multimedia project, that's fine. There's nothing wrong about this. It's war. Sometimes in real life, kids are forced to mature when they have to take on a parental role.
The show also doesn't treat the war as seriously as it could have. Every time...
That's not a retcon. That's your own personal opinion.
I'm reminded of what my primary school teacher said about World War I. People didn't go out of it and say, oh yeah, it was awesome, there were so many explosions and I got to shoot people. It's more like a sorrow reaction to losing friends and sacrifices they made in the name of duty. Now I know this is a kid's show, but the point is, this doesn't feel like a real war in any way. After all, it portrays the war criminals Anakin and Obi-Wan off like heroes, when what they did was anything but heroic.
Again, we already addressed the war crimes thing, but here you go. I think you hit it on the bat. It's a show for kids. Who is Lucas making for? Who has he always made Star Wars for? He's not making some Game of Thrones type drama. If anything, if this really was a response to prequel haters, he'd be, and who were mostly original trilogy fans that grew up with that trilogy, he'd be making an aged up show, with a similar tone of Andor trying to address them. He made this for kids. There's no address the prequel backlash. This was a show he made for 12-year-olds. It's how he didn't make the prequel trilogy for the original trilogy fans that had since grown up. He made it for kids. And he wasn't making, if you were 8 when Phantom Menace came out, or if you were 12 when Phantom Menace came out, well, when Clone Wars came out, you would have been 21. He's not making it for that audience. He's making it for the next generation. That's all Lucas has been doing.
Risk of assuming that everyone is already on the good guy's side and that they can never do anything bad because they're good. There's a reason I called TCW the dumb show they play over at Weenie Hut Juniors.
That doesn't sound like a retcon to me. It just sounds like your thoughts on how the show was written and how it could have been written better in your opinion. That wasn't a matter of retcons.
I feel like TCW has no respect for the audience. It's a prequel trilogy show in name only. And that makes you wonder who this was for, because
it was for the next generation of Star Wars fans and kids.
It's certainly not prequel fans like me.
It's similar.
This guy sounds just like someone who would have been, like a Red Letter Media person who would have been ripping apart the prequel trilogy, been like, this doesn't fit with the original trilogy. Who was this made for?
Here, Anakin's not otherwise still the same character as he is in the films. He's emotional, a struggling Jedi, rebellious, struggling with attachments, struggling with inner darkness, while trying to be a good Jedi, and he's brash and impulsive. The only one I can kind of understand is the voice change, but even then, it's not too different. Different animation where things are a little stylized.
It is. As I said, Matt Lucas was super ready to reprise his role, but they didn't use him. I don't know about you, but when I remember Anakin's portrayal in the Clone Wars, too many times are his actions not played off the way they probably should be. The war crimes thing is an obvious example, but there's a bunch more.
Okay, well again, sorry, but I'm gonna take George Lucas's takes on Star Wars over a random guy on the internet.
Executing that guy in Season 2 is casually shrugged off, and it doesn't matter. In fact, anyone who Anakin kills in this show is played off casually, or they hand-wave it away, and it's so fucking weak.
What do you mean they hand-wave it? The show clearly draws parallels and attention to the fact that this is signs of him becoming Darth Vader. It was a big deal about killing the Talmeric dude, and then Anakin killed him, and the Imperial March plays. They're saying that this is, this is a sign of him becoming Anakin. Now, I don't know if maybe, I saw someone else make a comment, so I don't know if this is trying to approach it from the angle of well, when he killed Count Dooku, he had serious hesitation about it, but this guy, it's just, whatever. To that, I would say Count Dooku was unarmed. Anakin disarmed him. Count Dooku was an unarmed prisoner. Talmeric was holding a grenade and was going to blow up the whole ship unless somebody stopped him. Talmeric was basically just the same as shooting someone in battle, whereas Dooku was like the guy was basically, surrendering, and Anakin decapitated him.
It's clear they prioritize making Anakin look cool over his personal conflict, which I valued far more. It's why I don't agree with this.
The show has a lot of, focus on Anakin's personal conflict. The slaves arc, the Clovis arc. I can keep going, but, the whole Obi-Wan undercover arc.
Assertion that he's still this or that.
But again, listen to him. None of this is retcons. This is just him saying, hey, the show could have been written better.
Because even if you wanted to say that, the top priority is absolutely way different. There's a reason prequel haters thought this depiction was hip and cool, and most of the time overlooked anything bad he does in the show to the point of not mentioning it.
The next retcon I've seen is Ahsoka.
Of course.
Her being Anakin's Padawan
What was the of course for?
doesn't retcon the films. There was no allusion to him not having a Padawan.
Okay, about Ahsoka, it doesn't directly retcon the films, but it completely fucks over it.
There you go. It doesn't completely retcon the films. You just debunked yourself.
Anakin's story, character arc, and so much more.
How?
It was part of that approach of making Anakin hip and cool, that he's matured.
George Lucas said he wanted to kind of focus on Anakin and Obi-Wan's friend dynamic, but he said to do that, he wanted to put him on equal ground, but to do that, obviously Anakin couldn't kind of be a Padawan anymore, so he put in Ahsoka to kind of not only work on maturing Anakin, but he said also to kind of act as like the young learner perspective of the show, so that way he could kind of put Anakin and Obi-Wan on equal footing to build their relationship from where we see in Attack of the Clones to where they are in Revenge of the Sith.
So much since Revenge of the Sith that hasn't even happened yet, that he's got his own Padawan, and all the mistakes are then applied to Ahsoka instead of Anakin. It's deflection more than anything. It still doesn't make any sense why the Council thought this was the solution. And when you consider that Anakin seemed...
Because, like I said, and like George Lucas has said, when you put people in that kind of parental role, they're forced to kind of grow up and mature a bit, a lot quicker than they normally would otherwise, naturally. So he said that's why he, in his mind, the Jedi would see Anakin in Attack of the Clones and be like, we need to, kind of chill this guy out. Let's give him a Padawan. Maybe that'll help mature him and kind of, especially because the fact, like, what did he do? He basically threw aside his mission to protect Padme to rush off to get his mom. And, that was him focusing on his attachment. So also part of the reasoning of giving him Ahsoka was to help, in time, he'd have to let go of Ahsoka. And so it was a way to help kind of Anakin learn to get over attachments.
pretty mature already by the start of the Clone Wars movie, it seems like a pointless addition. Listen, Ahsoka was nothing more than an afterthought squeezed in with next to no regard for how little sense it made.
That doesn't seem to be the approach George Lucas took if you look at his behind-the-scenes interviews, but okay.
And given she ended up surviving, and she was just off screen in Revenge of the Sith, it's dumb as shit. I mean, it's impossible to believe that these two Anakins are the same person. Attack of the Clones Anakin would have gotten Ahsoka killed in a few hours.
Even if she wasn't revenge.
I mean, he didn't get anybody else killed. On top of that, like you just said, it's dumb. That doesn't mean it's a retcon whether you think it's dumb or not.
Mentioned in Revenge of the Sith, well, Qui-Gon wasn't mentioned in the original trilogy, but he still exists.
Yeah, about that, let me ask you a question. How does Qui-Gon existing and being Obi-Wan's primary mentor negatively affect the story?
Well, to that I would say, the whole tension about Return of the Jedi is whether Luke is in the right to try to redeem his father or not. The Jedi mentor figures that we are, that we see, they're telling him, like, hey, no, and keep in mind, Lucas doesn't hold to the whole idea of, like, the Jedi are flawed or corrupt or anything. There may be some minor issues with them, but overall, the Jedi, as he put in the prequel trilogy, are basically the ideal Jedi. Obi-Wan and Yoda are telling him, like, hey, don't go to Vader. That's the whole tension of the film. They're saying you need to kill Vader, but the whole moral dilemma of the film in Return of the Jedi is, does Luke need to redeem Vader or kill him? That's his whole inner conflict. And Obi-Wan tries to appeal to him. He's like, look, like, I found Anakin. I trained him. Anakin's gone. But then if you see, with the context of the Phantom Menace and the prequels, you find out actually Qui-Gon was the one who found Anakin. Qui-Gon was the one who believed in Anakin. Obi-Wan calls Anakin another pathetic life form, and he compares him to Jar Jar. Obi-Wan didn't believe in Anakin. He only took Anakin upon himself because Qui-Gon asked him to as a dying wish. So it's like it changes the whole perspective of Obi-Wan. Now it's not this genuine guy of like, hey, I'm telling you, I trained Anakin, I believed in it, and he failed me. It's now Obi-Wan saying, like, yeah, there's this guy that my master believed in, and he wanted to train him. I didn't want to, but I kind of got stuck with him, and he fell to the dark side. But anyway, trust me, like, it just kind of affects Obi-Wan's character.
It doesn't. Qui-Gon is an extremely important character, and his death signified the beginning of the end, and if anything, made the story thematically stronger.
So, if he's an important character and Return of the Jedi or the original trilogy doesn't mention him, then again, we're just overlooking him in the same way that you're saying the films basically overlook the important character of Ahsoka that's now been added in TCW.
Cannot say the same about Ahsoka. All Ahsoka did was just shift the story and makes it so actually Anakin was way more mature than you saw in the prequels, and Ahsoka was an
Well, he's pretty similar in Revenge of the Sith, as we see, like, General Skywalker personas we see in Revenge of the Sith is pretty similar to Anakin in Clone Wars.
important part of his story. When
George Lucas called it consistent too.
she should have been in the prequel trilogy, but she obviously wasn't, because she's crammed in artificially.
Ahsoka being off and on her own mission isn't really relevant to the story Anakin is experiencing in the film, especially since Padme quickly becomes his main and only priority. And if you criticize the Jedi Council for giving Anakin a Padawan, well, the Jedi Council made a lot of mistakes and dumb decisions, and some would argue that was the point of the trilogy.
Before we continue, the point is that the Jedi were not on the lookout for the return of evil, and it slipped right under their noses. And the message is to not have...
Well, they knew about evil in Phantom Menace, and that's a whole 13 years before the Jedi Council was wiped out by Sidious, so...
that happen. Because evil is everywhere and in plain sight.
They were basically given the Sith's plot in Attack of the Clones by Dooku and did nothing. They didn't investigate the clones right away. They sent Anakin on a solo mission with Padme, even though Obi-Wan tells him he has a crush on her, and even knowing after this, they let Anakin take her back to Naboo after their whole little moment in Attack of the Clones. And in Revenge of the Sith, Anakin can still spend the night at Padme's place during Episode 3, and the Council can't put two and two together?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure the practical explanation is that there was a war going on, whether it be the day after, or what...
Okay, there's a war going on. They're distracted. I'll remember that.
While all of this was happening, the war was a distraction orchestrated by the Sith after all. Ahsoka being assigned as Anakin's apprentice had nothing to do with the distraction caused by the war. It's just the Council deciding on their own volition to trust what should be an emotional hothead with a kid in the middle of a war. Now that's what you call stupid.
General Grievous...
And I've explained. You know, I just already gave a list of stupid things the Council's done. You didn't really address that. But on top of that, you know, that you could say that they were misguided. But that was the reasoning why. And, I mean, to a degree, it kind of worked a bit.
Grievous' death
You're saying Anakin's mature in TCW, so it kind of worked.
is the key to ending the war, and instead of sending several Jedi, they sent Obi-Wan alone, even though other Jedi are on Coruscant?
On top of the fact that Obi-Wan has a legion of clone troopers, that only...
The clone troopers aren't going up against lightsaber-wielding General Grievous. If you know, you follow the Clone Wars multimedia project, and this was actually out before Revenge of the Sith. Grievous took out a handful of Jedi on Hypori. What good are clone troopers going to be against him?
We left 4 Jedi Masters at the temple, aka Mace Windu and the boys. And
Are you serious? Have you never watched Revenge of the Sith? Did you just say there's only 4 Jedi on Coruscant when Obi-Wan goes out? Like, there's other Jedi in person at the Council. There's Jedi walking around through the halls of Coruscant. There's Jedi that Anakin has to go to the temple to wipe out, but he becomes Darth Vader. Did you seriously just say that?
And all the other Jedi were away anyways. Yeah,
They were
it doesn't
not.
seem very stupid to me. Sounds like a very rational decision to send Obi-Wan and a legion of clone troopers. Especially now that the CIS is weak with Count Dooku gone.
And after learning...
If the CIS is weak and Count Dooku's gone and Grievous is the last thing stopping this war from ending, you send every last guy you can. You get this war knocked out of the park.
Palpatine is a Sith, they only send 4 Jedi.
The only 4 Jedi Masters available. 4 on 1.
There's other Jedi Knights, and you don't have to be there's more Masters than the 12 that were on the Council. Like, there's more Jedi Masters than just them. Master isn't someone who's on the Council. You could be a Jedi Master without being on the Council. There's other Jedi Masters at Coruscant.
One also sounds pretty unfair too, until it turned out Palps was far more powerful than they thought, and Mace Windu's boys paid the price for that.
So the Jedi making a dumb decision with Ahsoka and Anakin fits right in if you really want to perceive it that way.
Yeah, I don't think so.
Plus, the goal of Ahsoka was
doesn't
to
really
mature
elaborate.
Anakin after his issues in Attack of the Clones by forcing him to grow up, so it makes sense.
Sure it does, but why did Anakin start off the way he does?
So you just admitted, sure it does, it works. So you just basically debunked your last 2 minutes of argument.
If that was the point. Like, obviously...
So, again, I've already said, like, all we see of Anakin prior to the Clone Wars, or prior to him getting Ahsoka in the Clone Wars, is just General Skywalker. And if you look at General Skywalker in Clone Wars, and compare that to General Skywalker, Revenge of the Sith, Commander Skywalker in Attack of the Clones, it's pretty similar. We're not focusing on any of Anakin's inner conflict. All we see is him in a battle. That's it. And if you really want to get technical, one of the 2 prequel episodes before the Clone Wars movie shows Anakin, again, disobeying orders, rapidly changing goal because of what he thought was better when in that episode with the cloak ship at Admiral Trench. All he was supposed to do was just break through the blockade with the ship and go deliver supplies. But what's he do? He completely ignores orders and in a rash manner attacks Trench because that's what Anakin thinks is best. He just acts rash and impulsively.
Obviously, there was an ulterior motive with the characterization, but you won't admit that.
Because I don't
Another
see
iconic
that.
scene is being the guilds and corporate neutrality as presented in the show.
Yeah, this isn't something I personally talk about when discussing the story of Star Wars, so let's just skip this part.
Another big one is the inhibitor chips. I've made a video about why I think this works better, but for the retcon, Sam Witwer resolved this in a quote I already brought up. As he points out, Cody calls Palpatine my lord, but Palpatine isn't emperor yet, and the clones don't know he's a Sith. Some level of brainwashing is implied.
In regards to inhibitor chips, you have to wonder why they didn't just go with the original explanation. And that's where you realize the inhibitor chips were nothing but an excuse to have Dave Filoni write his favorite clones out of Order 66, while providing an artificial explanation for why...
It wasn't about writing favorite clones out. I mean, if you look at it, the only one that really got written out is Rex, and even then, Rex still executed Order 66 to the degree. He just didn't have to follow through on it because Ahsoka got the chip out of his head, but he still started firing at him. It was, as you're about to explain, make it so that it makes sense that these guys form friendships with the Jedi and, don't resist the order.
The clones obeyed Order 66 if they're so close with their commanders. Like, they literally wrote themselves into a corner there, but that plot device also came with a get-out-of-jail-free card when Dave Filoni felt like it. That's what you call lazy writing. It was not...
I mean, there's so many other aspects to it. Maybe it's because they just thought, like, oh, we're going to spend time developing these soldiers, but then to make it so that it makes sense that they would turn on their Jedi, that they fought alongside for years and formed, close friendships with it, you're not leaving it the chance. I've done a whole other video talking about this. Like, for Sidious, it's basically guaranteeing that this gets executed, especially since in the Clone Wars multimedia project or in post-Revenge of the Sith stories, weren't there clones who disobeyed the order? Not a lot, but a few, right? It's Palpatine trying to avoid that. On top of that, too, like, the Canon Zones say clones can think creatively. Isn't it possible that they could sit there and think, well, hey, this could be an enemy trick? The Separatists is on their last leg. Why wouldn't they try something like this? Maybe we should, hold off on this.
Nothing but pretending to enhance the movies.
I've even seen some people get upset because the Kaminoans say the clones are genetically modified to follow orders, even though the chips are basically a form of genetically modifying the clone to obey an order.
The Kaminoan states that they were modified to be less independent than the original host. But then in TCW, they've got all the free will in the world. And then again, after writing themselves into...
They also say clones can think creatively. Like, that's a very fine line to walk. How do you give someone the ability to kind of not be like a programmed droid, to think creatively, think intelligently, but then actually they don't have free will? Like, what?
...a corner, they came up with this bullshit explanation to justify it.
On top of that, even if the Kaminoans are basically saying...
So all he's really kind of done so far is just say, like, no, they should have stuck with another way. Like, he's just saying it's BS, etc. Like, he doesn't explicitly say, like, how it retcons. He's just like, well, see, they had to come up with this after the fact to explain other things they've written. Like, that's the behind-the-scenes reason. Duh, that doesn't necessarily mean, like, that's a retcon. That's just, hey, this is the behind-the-scenes reason of how we got to that point.
Saying that they tampered with the DNA of the clones, and that's supposed to be our Order 66 explanation. Adding inhibitor chips does not contradict that, as it's still an organic modification and tampering, but it's basically just an extra safeguard.
Yeah, nah. In case you didn't watch the Clone Wars arc, The fact that Order 66 could be accidentally triggered was a major oversight.
Well, they don't know why it triggered. It was just a rotting chip. I mean, these are organic chips, so they could rot. And on top of that, it happened once, as opposed to what? How many clone troopers disobeyed Order 66? Wasn't there like 5 different cases in the EU?
And it was better to just condition the soldiers to be loyal. Also, I've probably mentioned this a
Conditioning that can also be undone. You could be unconditioned.
few times, but I remember the Lore Master made this very video, and I'm pretty sure those Roman soldiers didn't have inhibitor chips.
This isn't real life.
On top of the assumption that the clones love the Jedi to death, people just assume that the clones would disobey the highest authority and commit treason just to save their Jedi generals, when most of them already don't have full independence.
Well, when they already like their Jedi generals, they're very close to their Jedi generals, and their generals are also a very high authority too. Like, that's who they've been reporting to directly. You know?
It doesn't contradict, it just expands. Also, the Kaminoans don't really know the true nature of the inhibitor chips as we see in TCW. Dooku lies to them and tells them it's simply a safeguard against rogue Jedi. So the Kaminoans establishing the genetic modifications in Attack of the Clones isn't a retcon because the Kaminoans don't even know what the chips really do or their true purpose.
Wait, are you telling me the Kaminoans who created the chips in the first place don't even know what they do, or that they didn't snoop into the chips in the first place?
Well, you know, to quote you, in case you didn't watch the Clone Wars arc, the Kaminoans they know how it works, but they were told it was for a safeguard against rogue Jedi. They weren't told it was to wipe out the Jedi. They were told it was a rogue guard against a safeguard against rogue Jedi. So yeah, that's in the arc.
Also, too, keep in mind that the Kaminoans were told by Dooku that the Jedi couldn't know anything about the inhibitor chips and what they did and what they were meant for, and once the Jedi started to kind of find out in Season 6, the Kaminoans were told to keep as much hidden as possible. So, sure enough, when Obi-Wan shows up in Attack of the Clones, the Kaminoans not just going to go, oh yeah, by the way, they have these inhibitor chips in there that are meant as safeguards for rogue Jedi. They're going to keep it hush-hush and keep it quiet. They're not going to scream it out loud to the Jedi.
This is all bullshit and you know it.
I've seen it.
That's not really a factual rebuttal. That's not explaining how that's a retcon. That's literally in the show. Literally in the show, he says, hey, the Jedi cannot know about this. So why would, when, you know, the Kaminoans meet the Jedi, why would they just blurt that out if their buyer is, or their client is telling them, don't tell the Jedi about that? That's not BS. That's what's in the show. That is the lore. That's what the scenario they're giving us. So, no, you did not address how that was a retcon. If anything, your response to that was BS.
Suggested, too, that the clones don't have free will, that they're essentially mindless droids with few exceptions, but the Kaminoans saying clones can think creatively seems to imply there is some sort of free will and free thought on their behalf.
Yeah, there's a fine line between being less independent and just being a mindless droid. It was a balance between the two.
And of course...
So maybe George Lucas interpreted the balance, or the fine line and the balance point a little differently than you did.
Moving on, a retcon often brought up is Anakin fighting Dooku and Kenobi fighting Grievous.
Yeah, that sort of retcon is just laziness. That they couldn't just come up with a different scenario for Anakin and Obi-Wan to face. And so...
Well, I mean, they did have them fight Ventress. There were other villains, but I think part of it was they wanted to do more with those characters and those dynamics. Like, George Lucas and Dave Filoni aren't idiots, especially because how many times has Dave been like, oh yeah, we did this to make sure Anakin didn't avoided meeting Grievous. So they're aware of those lines. It just, they didn't seem that, or they deemed it, you know, they deemed that the lines between Anakin and Dooku and Kenobi and Grievous were more lenient and more open to interpretation, and they worked with that, and they decided to explore dynamics between these characters. I wouldn't call that lazy. They easily could have come up with different situations, but this is the story George Lucas wanted to tell.
So it's consistently got to be Dooku and Grievous.
First off, Anakin fighting Dooku isn't an explicit retcon, it's just the implication of the line that's retconned. And while it is a little funky, it's not universe breaking.
That's just lazy. Why didn't they...
So calling it lazy is not a retcon. You could say this could have been written differently or better, but that's not saying it's a retcon.
Just have Ventress duel Anakin here.
Chalk it up to poor trash talk. And as for Kenobi...
Also, fun fact, the Clone Wars arc with Dark Disciple would have had Obi-Wan and Anakin split up And Anakin would have fought Dooku by himself and would have lost, obviously, since, he's still alive in Revenge of the Sith. So they found a way to fix that line to make it, I shouldn't say fix, but they found a way to make that line make complete sense.
Fighting Grievous, it could be chalked up to either poor trash talk or Grievous receiving new training from Dooku after Ventress's departure, with him only knowing combat before that due to his prior life as a warrior, which I actually think is a really cool explanation.
I sure the hell don't. It's again poor.
Oh, so you don't like that explanation. That doesn't mean it's factually wrong. I don't like that. They should have done something different.
Attention to detail, and them running out of ideas on what scenarios Anakin and Obi-Wan could encounter.
Or maybe it's just they wanted the main prominent heroes of the era to face off against the main prominent villains of the era?
And this is literally the debut and first season of the fucking show. How could you have ran out of ideas already?
Again, maybe it's not because they're running out of ideas. Maybe it's because that's the story they wanted to tell.
Also, regarding the Dooku thing, Anakin and Dooku fight in the Clone Wars film that George Lucas was a major part of, and on top of that, did press for. So, if you have an issue with that, you gotta take that up with George Lucas.
Oh, now you bring up George Lucas. I've talked about George Lucas's involvement in TCW, and from what I've gathered, he never wrote any of the episodes himself. The show took second priority to the films, and it was a general lack of commitment to what he previously made, because prequel hate was a thing. Whether it was George or not.
So, a lot there. First off, if that's the information you've gathered wrong and you haven't done your research. George was very involved in the Clone Wars. That's part of what this whole video is about. On top of that, though, you literally said there, George, notice how you twist the words. He didn't write any of the episodes. Well, Dave Filoni only wrote a couple of the episodes prior to Season 7. On top of that, though, writing the script is different from writing the full-on story. George Lucas wrote most of the stories for the show. And he worked with writers on the outlines and then approved the scripts afterwards. Young Indiana Jones is a show often attributed to George Lucas. He didn't write any of the episodes, but he wrote the stories for every single one. As far as the prequel hate narrative, we already addressed that. I've addressed that in further depth in my George Lucas video. Go ahead and check it out. It's in the Clone Wars section if you really want to dive deeper into that.
It was short-sighted as fuck, and hopefully by now, I've demonstrated why. All it did...
So again, you're trashing George Lucas as you literally said, well, whether he's involved or not, who cares? It's bad. But now you sound like the prequel trilogy haters. I'm sorry, but I'm going to take George Lucas's takes on Star Wars over you.
It was create the myth that the prequels are so horrible that you've got to retcon them immensely to wriggle in room for good storytelling. Complete bullshit debunked by the Clone Wars multimedia project. A collection of stories that didn't have to bring Maul back or change Anakin's personality to tell some damn good stories.
They didn't change
The other
Anakin's
major one I see
personality.
brought up is Kenobi finding out Dooku is Tyrannus. There's a whole explanation I could get into, but I'll try to sum it up by the point that the damage was done. It was too late to do anything. And even then, by episode 3, they were skeptical of Palpatine, and this might just be the canon reason why. Dooku straight up tells them in Attack of the Clones what's going on, and they ignore it anyway, so I don't see how this is too different.
Now, they absolutely bended things too far. Especially when Yoda gets a vision of Order 66 and he does nothing. He does...
What was that you said earlier? They were in the middle of a war? They were distracted? Huh.
Doesn't even tell anyone about it. It's lame.
Even so, from in-universe, there was no real way out of this. Public opinion was already turning against them. To find out they've been fighting with an army made by Dooku would blow things out of the water.
So why didn't they even try to have a contingency for this at the very least?
Maybe because they were in a war and they were distracted?
Why'd they just keep doing this shit like nothing was learned?
It'd be similar to if we suddenly learned the whole U.S. Army was conditioned by the Russians. How would that play out?
Good question, actually. And I can guarantee way differently if we're being realistic.
Guarantee? How? You don't really elaborate on that.
I don't know how the American army would be conditioned by Russia, but maybe you've inspired a hit story. Bound to be better thought out.
So he doesn't
than
really
this.
address. He just
So I
starts
suppose that's
going off
one
on a
good
tangent.
thing you've done.
We also don't have proof other than eyewitness testimony, and even then, they'd look like idiots for not having investigated that sooner. They can't recuse themselves from the war because not only would innocents die while they take a stand, but the Republic would lose the war and Dooku would basically take control of the galaxy via that way, letting the Sith win. So, Yeah.
I also have to point out how the Republic won every single battle in this show anyways. So
The beginning of season 2 starts with them fleeing a battle that they lost. And just because a majority of the battles on the screen that we saw, they won, or they came out on, on top at least, it doesn't mean that there aren't other battles going on that they lose. Like, they mention other battles that they lose. And we didn't get to see the rest of the show either. That was planned. But that's not a retcon. That's your own personal opinion about what's better in writing quality.
The Jedi at this point would turn the tide. The Clone Wars is literally like slaying a Hydra. You chop off the head and 2 more grow back. But instead of heads, it's plot holes.
They couldn't raise a new army. The clones have been fighting for over 2 years with the Jedi by this point.
Yeah, where are the militias that the Clone Wars multimedia project had?
The army that we see in the movies is the clones. That's what they're working with. Or that's what George is working with. He's not doing all this other EU stuff. On top of that, though, I made the point. Like, they've said the clones have fought side by side with them for at least a couple of years at this point. Like, the clones have proven themselves.
They didn't have any inherent reason to distrust them. As for why it's not connected to the chips from a few episodes back, probably because to them that...
I thought I addressed the Yoda vision thing. Maybe he cut it out. Maybe I did it in a separate part of the video. But Yoda doesn't trust... That's why I was waiting to comment on it. But when he brought up Yoda's vision, like... Yoda, how many times has Yoda been like, always in motion is the future. You can't trust visions. He says that a few times in the Clone Wars. He tells that to Anakin in Revenge of the Sith, with the whole Padme thing. He tells that to Luke when he's like, oh, my friends are on Cloud City. He's like, difficult to tell. Always in motion is the future.
That matter was resolved, and they moved on. Keep in mind, from the Jedi's perspective, it's basically a clone that went mad and shot his Jedi. He died, and then another clone went AWOL and died. The chips inside them were pretty much sold to the Jedi as genetic modifications the Kaminoans told Kenobi about. Yeah, Fives told Anakin that was a plot to destroy the Jedi, but Anakin clearly didn't believe him, especially once the Chancellor was brought up in that.
So far, you're making me want to watch Spider-Man 2 instead.
So see, I just provided the perfect valid explanation for all this stuff, and he's just, well, I want to watch Spider-Man 2 instead. What?
For Yoda's visions later, again, it's just
okay, here we go.
Yoda's quick to ignore visions, saying always in motion is the future.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure in this context, Yoda wouldn't just do nothing, just sit on his fat ass and let it happen.
And it was one vision that happened.
I mean, again, Yoda's like, he asks Qui-Gon in this, after he sees the vision, he says to Qui-Gon, such evil, is there any hope that the Jedi can prevail? And Qui-Gon says, there's always hope, my friend. So right off the bat, Yoda already is skeptical of visions, but then he's got Qui-Gon, the literal, force spirit, is telling him, hey, there's always hope. It's not doom and gloom. Obviously that we could see as the audience that has a different perspective for us as the audience, knowing how the rest of the story plays out. But Yoda's hearing that and probably interpreting that different. And some of those visions he sees in that cloud don't actually end up happening.
The Jedi fighting the clones. The rest of his visions had nothing to do with them. On top of that, we don't know the Sith Lord's plan, and acting out could be their downfall.
So doing nothing was their downfall. Got it.
So yeah, all in all, I don't see it as a universe-breaking issue. Even though retcons can be subjective at times, the 2000s prequel haters had a long list of retcons between the trilogies. I don't think a lot of them hold up. I think a lot of the ones from TCW could be resolved. And let's say, for argument's sake, there are retcons between the films and TCW. So, there are retcons between the film trilogies. Empire says Obi-Wan's master was Yoda. The Jedi Master who instructed me, not a Jedi Master. So do we throw out Phantom Menace? Even if episode True tried to fix it by showing Yoda teaching younglings, this was after the fact fix.
So part of this whole section was, again, because the video was addressing EU purists, I was saying, hey, you're going to throw out TCW because there's issues with the films. Well, are you going to throw out newer films that retcon pre-established films?
With episode 1, which makes no mention of that, and even then, it's not really stated Kenobi did train with Yoda as a youngling, except for in Clone Wars Season 6.
Yeah, I've already explained this. And besides, on that second point, you're supposed to watch the prequels first anyways.
Okay, but that's irrelevant to the fact that the originals came out first, so the originals are the one that established the continuity that the prequels had to keep up. That's like saying, oh, well, is there an issue with Revenge of the Sith and Clone Wars? Well, you're supposed to watch Clone Wars before Revenge of the Sith, so, just hand wave it away. That's basically what you're saying. No, it doesn't matter about how you're supposed to watch it. The originals came out first, so you have to abide by that continuity.
Look at this from the perspective of watching the originals first, instead of adjusting their viewing experience. And it's annoying as hell.
Return of the Jedi established Leia knew her mother. Revenge of the Sith retcon that. Do we throw 3 out?
No, dude. Too many people look at this from the perspective of a real-world baby not remembering their
How many things have you looked at here through a real-world perspective?
mother, if that's the only time they saw them. But Leia is not a regular infant. She's actually a Force adept, one of the most powerful in the galaxy, the offspring of the Chosen One, in fact.
That doesn't mean she's going to all of a sudden develop memory, a couple years before a human standardly does.
Episode 4 established the Republic was 1,000 generations, but Episode 2 said 1,000 years. Do we throw that out?
No. Obi-Wan said the Jedi were the Guardians for 1,000 generations.
He said they were the guardians of peace and justice in the Old Republic for over 1,000 generations. He didn't just say, they're guardians for 1,000 generations. He said of the Republic for 1,000 generations. And 1,000 generations, yeah, that could be literally, maybe it's 999, maybe it's 1,001. But that doesn't mean it's, a generation is roughly 20, 25 years, so 1,000 years is a fraction of that. He's not off by that much.
Not the Republic.
Besides, isn't this whole video about you taking things very literal, the lines, etc., but now in between the films we're going to ignore that, but when the Clone Wars retcons a small line, then it's, we got to take it very literal, etc.
So even from this G-canon perspective, the Jedi being older than the Republic doesn't affect much. It seems like they're just naturally intertwined.
That's still a retcon.
Episode 4 established Leia as an Organa. Episode 6 retcon that with her as Luke's sister. Do we throw that out?
What kind of complaint is that? Also, again, how does Leia not being a blood
That's, again, pointing out a retcon, a change.
relative of the Organas fuck over the story exactly?
A New Hope established Anakin and Vader were separate people, and the early Empire scripts proved this. The Vader change came later, and Empire retconned Anakin and Vader to be one and the same, leaving Return of the Jedi to have to try to sort it out.
Introducing Penn Station's Pen Pairs for $7.99. A tree, of grilled subs paired with fresh cut fries.
Can we throw out Empire?
I thought George Lucas stated that he came up with the plot twist shortly after he was done with A New Hope.
Shortly after A New Hope, when he was working on Empire Strikes Back.
Regardless, how does this shift negatively affect the story?
Well, it completely changes who Obi-Wan is. At first we see Obi-Wan like it was meant to be sincere, like, your father died? Or how did your father die? Well, he was killed by Darth Vader. It was supposed to be sincere, but it completely changes Obi-Wan's personality and how he approaches Luke when we look at it retrospectively, and that's why when Luke calls him out, he's like, hey, you lied to me. You told me this, but actually it's this. And Obi-Wan's like, well, from a certain point of view, and that's why Luke's like, are you kidding me? From a certain point of view? Like, even Luke doesn't buy it. It just makes Obi-Wan look like kind of a jackal.
Turning Obi-Wan's words into misdirection exactly.
New Hope established that Jedi and Republic is ancient and long gone. The prequels revealed that it was less than 20 years. Do we throw out the whole prequel trilogy?
That's not even a valid example. Going by George
It is still a
Lucas's
retcon.
original definition, it would
Original
have been
definition, so he
35
changed
years,
it.
Not 20. But even then, that's not ancient whatsoever. A New Hope still maintains the vibe that the Jedi are long gone.
The Jedi establishes Obi-Wan takes Anakin on as his Padawan, but Phantom Menace shows he has no choice but to do it because Qui-Gon essentially made him. Do we throw out Phantom Menace?
Wait. How is that a contradiction? Qui-Gon gave his dying wish, then Obi-Wan took Anakin on as his apprentice. Those two do not contradict each other.
Well, he did, because he says, I took it upon myself to train him as a boy, when I first found your father. But it was actually Qui-Gon who found him. It was Qui-Gon who wanted him to be a Jedi, and he forced Obi-Wan to take him on. And we've already dived a little further into that earlier in.
Where do we draw the line? If we're allowing wiggle room for the films, we have to allow wiggle room for TCW as well.
Actually, we don't. And that's because TCW screws over the story completely. As I've hopefully demonstrated...
That's not how George Lucas saw it.
In this video. TCW changes the story for the worse and cheapens it.
Again, that's your opinion. And on top of that, like, George Lucas has reinterpreted his movies, his artwork before, without retconning the explicit facts stated. And a lot of people thought what he did with reinterpreting the prequel or the original trilogy and through the lens of the prequel trilogy was for the worse, but I don't think you'd take that approach.
And generally backtracks, just because of how vocal prequel haters could be. I do not appreciate weakness like that, and I'm sick of people acting like the retcon
Your whole video has been weakness.
themselves are the biggest problem. No, it's how the retcons affect the symbolism, the arcs, and the meaning of the story. And TCW does this negatively, and makes the message and story of Star Wars far
Yeah, he hasn't really dived too deep into that.
weaker. So hopefully I've made my case why Darth Momo here is wrong about the Clone Wars being harmless, and
I don't think you made any case.
hopefully I've demonstrated a tad bit why I prefer the Clone Wars multimedia project.
That's about all your video is about.
I'm JJ Plagiarisms, and until next time, what are stories but mystery boxes?
So again, that was a lot of nothing. Not really impressed by that, but like I said, you know, JJ, if you watch this and you watch this all the way through and you're tempted to respond, let's not do these back and forth wars. I've already done that one with scruffy looking Nerf herder. Let's have a conversation if you really want to take it further. But if you want to let it die here, I'm content with letting it end here. Otherwise, I'm ready to move on, guys. We've got other videos in the works. I'm working on a couple books I'm trying to get out. I want to be done with this. I want to move on from this EU stuff. Like, let's move on. I'm ready to move forward. Thank you guys for joining in. Darth Momo out, and may the Force be with you. Always. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to the channel. If you liked the video, comment down below and hit that like button. Oh, and check out some of my other videos. I'm sure you'll find them in the light.